Welcome back to In-Depth Literature. I do apologize for the delay, but today we are finally returning for our highly anticipated, hopefully, analysis slash review of Victor Hugo's Les Misérables, the infamous Les Misérables. Some of you may have seen the films, the plays, some of the musicals. Now, I will say that Les Misérables is all-encompassing. It's a big commitment, whether it's the film or obviously the book is probably the largest commitment. And the book, written by Victor Hugo, obviously, is where you will get the best experience out of Les Mis. And I definitely recommend that you start with the book. And a couple of just important sort of things to discuss with Les Misérables. Post-revolution, French Revolutionary France and Paris is sort of the underlying foundation for a lot of the social interactions, the character arcs that take place in Les Misérables and sort of lead up to, the French Revolution, that is sort of leading up to some of the other struggles that take place in Les Misérables. And I also think that it's important to just, learn to enjoy the story, learn to enjoy the experience, the characters, the different, aspects of the plot in Les Misérables as you're reading it. But simultaneously, you should be sort of further investigating some of the events that pop up, like Napoleon, Waterloo, the July Rebellion, sort of the other battles and sort of altercations and sort of political sort of complications, situations that sort of take place throughout the course of Les Misérables. But obviously, there's a central cast of characters, a central sort of thematic plot that sort of takes place during Les Misérables. And you could pretty much yank all the characters and all the character arcs and sort of all the relationships and just sort of yank them out of Les Misérables and put them in another situation. But you would be missing something, obviously, and that would be sort of the post-French Revolution culture, the political culture of Paris and France. There's a lot of different things going on, and sort of similar to what we discussed in Hugo's Hunchback of Notre Dame. There's not only sort of this sort of personal, spiritual, moral character arc that obviously takes place with the characters and the relationships of Les Misérables or Notre Dame, but also, similar to the Hunchback of Notre Dame, sort of the Les Misérables, we sort of see the sort of the social and the political background of Paris and France and a lot of particular architectural locations and battles and political and military figures sort of also serving as sort of another character arc in itself in the novel, sort of alluding to this idea of sort of a more, how do I say, sociological study. And yes, there is a spiritual sort of religious moral character arc that obviously takes place with Jean Valjean and Cosette and Marius and some of the other fantastic characters. But if we yank them out of that sort of political, religious, social context of Paris and post-revolutionary France, obviously you could still have a story, but there would be so many missing gaps. So I think it's important to sort of weigh those, different aspects of Hugo's agenda. Hugo is a rambler, a sort of a political rambler, a moral rambler, he's just very, very long-winded. And his own rhetoric obviously seeps into the pages and paragraphs and sentences of Les Misérables, and that's kind of what we would expect from our good friend Hugo. And at times, yes, it can be a little distracting, it can be a little meandering, but every single thing in this novel, is necessary to sort of get Hugo's point across. And why is he sort of injecting so many of his philosophical ideas, his philosophical, moral, sort of sociological rhetoric? And that serves as, like we discussed with Hunchback of Notre Dame, as sort of a mechanism or a vehicle to sort of put further in context the motivations and the relationships and the character arcs of Jean Valjean, Cosette, Fantine, Javert, and all the other wonderful characters, Bishop Muriel, who the novel sort of begins with this sort of idea of morality, and this old bishop named Bishop Muriel, who sort of takes in the wandering, struggling Jean Valjean, and that sets the novel's tone for this larger universal social struggle of good and evil. Now, when we're talking about Les Misérables as well, like we said, you don't want to treat it like a history lesson, but it is kind of a historical novel. So you have to sort of juggle those two ideas. Don't get too stuck on, mastering all the stuff about Napoleon and the French Revolution and the Battle of Waterloo and the July Rebellion. Obviously Victor Hugo is going to tell you mostly everything you need to know. Sometimes it could get it does get a little confusing and meandering. You're not quite sure what battle he's referring to, what a monarchy figure he's referring to, what sort of political espionage event that he's discussing. But the novel sort of bounces back and forth between Hugo's instruction of the history of Paris and France, as well as the instruction and the experience that you get from the characters that are sort of immersed, for better or worse, in this sort of political, moral, and religious existence that takes place throughout the pages of Les Misérables. And I think there's a tendency to sort of obviously to maybe perhaps simplify the rhetoric of Les Misérables and say, oh, it's about good and evil, it's about redemption, it's about love. And yes, it is all of those things, but it's sort of about how these characters struggle with their identities, sort of their social identities, their personal moral identities, their self-esteem, their histories. All of these characters are forced to face themselves 100%. None of these characters are getting out alive on an emotional, spiritual level without sort of confronting their shortcomings, without confronting their inadequacies and their relationships and their histories. And we get this idea that yes, humanity struggles on a not only a physical level, but also a spiritual and a moral and a religious struggle. We've been reading a lot of Dostoevsky as well, and Dostoevsky sort of focuses on sort of this dance between the psychological battles of his characters, in context of the social culture of St. Petersburg or various places in Russia. And that's sort of similar to what, Victor Hugo does, but Victor Hugo is obviously more of a romantic era writer. He's considered, sort of a romantic period writer, like we would consider the romantic period of literature, sort of mid 1800s, where obviously Dostoevsky is a little bit later and obviously focuses on completely different themes. And though Victor Hugo is not afraid to explore sort of the downtrodden, mentally ill, suffering, impoverished characters, he's not afraid to touch upon good and evil. We get sort of this epic, grandiose sort of idea of redemption and of good always usually triumphing over evil, which is not necessarily unique or significant to Victor Hugo in himself, but he's not going to really ever, I haven't read, all of Victor Hugo's works, but regardless of his, sometimes tragic endings like we see in Hunchback of Notre Dame, there is sort of a moral, sort of religious, sociological redemption that takes place at the end of Victor Hugo's romantic novels that we just don't always see in other novels. So Victor Hugo is obviously, very dependent and contingent upon his knowledge. Obviously he was a political figure, he was a literary figure, he was, definitely, in the upper classes, and he sort of was well educated enough to write something, as in depth as Les Misérables. And so oftentimes, Victor Hugo can come across as kind of preachy, sort of in the manner that Tolstoy does. Tolstoy is another, author that is similar in his scope, in his vision, in his epic grandiosity, and his meandering, and his rambles, and his sort of instructional rhetoric. Adds to this more epic aesthetic that we see in the romantic novels. I'm not saying that Leo Tolstoy was a romantic novel. He was more of a sociological, I guess you could say, slightly political but sort of moral writer, whereas Victor Hugo was all of those things, but in this context of this, sort of spiritual, overarching, sociological, like we said, take a shot every time I say sociological, sort of epic, agenda that takes place, that the characters of the universe, of the world, particularly in Notre Dame and Les Misérables, they cannot be separated from the social context that they exist in. Obviously with other writers, like somebody like, I don't know, Thomas Wolfe or Charles Bukowski, or any of the innumerable writers on our bookshelves, Hemingway, even, for example, they are sort of less reliant on sort of the social, political stuff that's taking place throughout their novels, whereas Victor Hugo is very focused and interested in the impact of social evils, sociological, religious events, military events, and how that affects his characters and his relationships and his character arcs. So like we said in the beginning of this lecture, it's very difficult to sort of ignore the sort of socio-political undertones and socio-political religious history, the architectural history that takes place. Obviously, there's a huge section of the novel, well, not a huge section, but a couple chapters worth of a section of Victor Hugo going on and on about the catacombs, the sewers, I should say. Not catacombs, the sewers of Paris, and sort of the way that he was critiquing the way that the sewers were constructed and built, but also the way that the waste of humanity is a reflection of this sort of overarching human dominance that takes place, obviously, in a huge metropolitan city like Paris, France. Is that these characters exist, and they're just like a handful among millions within this huge beast of society and this huge overarching beastly swarm of humanity. And that is very similar to kind of Tolstoy's rhetoric, is that these characters and these relationships and these character arcs and these tragedies that take place are not isolated from the society and the world and the politics that exists simultaneously around them, and vice versa. So sort of in a nutshell, I do want to discuss, I'm not going to discuss the entire plot because we would probably be here all day, but I did want to sort of introduce some of the characters and get you guys interested, guys and gals out there interested in exploring the universe of Les Misérables. Now, Les Misérables clocks in at nearly almost 2,000 pages. This particular version has 1,462. So it's a large commitment, but it moves rather quickly. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to keep track of. Obviously, we've got a lot of sticky notes. You don't have to keep sticky notes like I do. I definitely recommend it to sort of get the gears turning in your head, make notes of things, make lists, important characters, important events, and sort of engage with the text, because these characters demand that you spend a very large amount of time with them, and you cannot speed read Les Misérables, as we discussed in some of our book hauls. It's impossible. So you're going to be spending a lot of time with Jean Valjean and Cosette and Javert and Marius and Bishop Muriel and the Thuardinaires and all of these different characters that are introduced in the course of Les Misérables. And it's important to invest yourself in the characters, but not to take sides. I think there's a tendency to sort of take sides with different characters, and you will probably naturally, progress into sort of taking sides with Jean Valjean and perhaps, obviously, Cosette. We all love Cosette. She is sort of the female protagonist of the novel that is adopted by abusive parents after the death, I believe, of her mother, Fantine. Sort of Jean Valjean comes in to sort of rescue her, and they begin a life together. Not a romantic life, but part of Jean Valjean's journey, part of his experience and his metamorphosis towards this ascension to forgiveness and of justice is to adopt Cosette, and he's never been married, he's never had kids, he's been in prison most of his life, Jean Valjean. He's looked upon society as a complete sort of menace and sort of a social pariah perhaps, and nobody really wants to give him a chance until he meets the Bishop Muriel, is given sort of a second chance, but then he gets in trouble again, and he is, has to sort of face justice at some point again. And he's always sort of, he's been in and out of prison his entire life. He's been shackled, not only physically, but emotionally, and he's never been able to really begin a life of his own. He's been stealing food, he's hungry, and there is sort of a scenario that takes place in the beginning of the book where he is trying to get food and nobody wants to let him in, and I think he ends up stealing food from a young child or something to try to, avoid starvation. And so, when we talked about not taking sides with the characters, because obviously Jean Valjean is, although he's impoverished, he's been struggling, hasn't really been given a chance, he's not a perfect character by any means. And when we sort of get to the metamorphosis of his relationship with adopting Cosette, he sort of develops this overly possessive, overly romantic relationship with her, not in a negative way or like an abusive way, but his redemption, his whole sort of vehicle to be forgiven, not only to forgive himself, but also with God and society, he believes, is to sort of nurture his relationship with Cosette. And he, obviously adores her and he wants her to do well, and he doesn't want her to go astray. He doesn't want her to experience the trauma that he's gone through. But that all changes when Marius kind of comes into the picture. And Marius is another fascinating character. And his, once he falls in love with Cosette, he sort of tries to pursue her, but he's really awkward and he can't really quite manage to make that first move, and he sort of misses opportunities, and then they're sort of reunited. And then throughout that point in time, Jean Valjean obviously is disguised as Monsieur Madeleine. Madeleine is sort of the pseudo Jean Valjean, and the purpose for Monsieur Madeleine, the pseudo made up identity, the nickname that Jean Valjean takes on, sort of the purpose for that is so that Jean Valjean can sort of shed his past, his former, life of incarceration, and sort of that way he can sort of exist in society and do all the things that he wants to do. But eventually even Jean Valjean is forced to confront his past, his secrecies, and some of those inadequacies and some of those lies and betrayals sort of come up. But we forgive Jean Valjean because he did it for a good purpose, and he sort of nurtured and adopted Cosette, obviously, and Cosette adores Jean Valjean, but she becomes conflicted, obviously, when she ends up falling in love with Marius. And we get this, not only is Jean Valjean struggling emotionally, mentally, and socially with his checkered background of being a convict most of his life. He's also struggling with the political tensions that are existing in Paris at this time, but he's also sort of confronting his parental, I guess you could say, patriarchal way that he views himself. He views himself as Cosette's savior. He views himself as contingent and highly dependent on Cosette's love and affection to sort of redeem him. And that all sort of comes into, not only does it come crumbling, so to speak, but it sort of comes, obviously he has to face, like every father or every mother must face at some point in their life, hopefully that their daughter or their son will grow up and find love and sort of leave the nest. So we have this beautiful sort of personal metamorphosis that takes place with Jean Valjean, not only facing his traumatic past, his checkered background, his all the convictions and charges that he's been accused of throughout his life, stealing, and he's even accused of murder, at various points in the novel, and he has to go in hiding. But he's constantly rescuing other characters. He's a very selfless character, but when it comes to Cosette, he becomes rather selfish, because he wishes to, that's the only love that he's ever had in his life. And what's so profound and beautiful about it, it's not a romantic love, obviously, but it is a sort of a parental, spiritual love that he has for Cosette, and he views her as sort of his angel, and vice versa. She sort of grows up, viewing Jean Valjean as her savior and as her, sort of ticket out of the abyss of life struggles. And also we have towards the midway, halfway point of the novel, sort of this, I don't want to say resurrection, but we have this sort of metamorphosis, I guess we could say, like we said before, of Jean Valjean sort of evolving with his interactions with the other characters. Obviously, he rescues Javier, and then he rescues Marius as well, and he's constantly saving other characters. But unfortunately, a character like Javier, we haven't really discussed too much of him. And when you're reading the pages of Les Misérables, it can be hard to keep track of not necessarily who is who, but it's hard to keep track of the characters' life history, their familial history, their political history. And obviously, Les Misérables is something that you will read, endlessly throughout your life, hopefully, and you will read other Victor Hugo novels. So, a lot of people say, do you recommend Les Misérables? And I definitely recommend it if you can, really stick it out. We are going to go through some of our sticky notes here to sort of further discuss sort of the thematic themes, the thematic plots. We're not going to go through all of them, but the beginning section of the novel is sort of, I want to say hi to Pete. Hi, Pete. I don't know if you guys can hear him meowing. Here he is. Pete. Pete's never read a book in his life, but that's okay. So we have Bishop Muriel, sort of, in context, he's discussing different things with some of these individuals, and thematically at least, on the beginning of the novel. And we have the horrors of the guillotine and this idea of capital punishment versus redemption. What's the best way to handle criminals in society? What is the best way to sort of have corporal punishment, if any? Now, sort of this idea of the upright, virtuous life is also another huge thematic theme in the pages of Les Misérables, which centers or sort of introduces the whole topic in conjunction with Jean Valjean. And the beginning of the novel is all about good and evil, right and wrong, punishment, crime and punishment, all that sort of thing. My note here says uprightness is at the center of Hugo's worldview. So we can sort of see, it's not too hard to kind of understand what Victor Hugo is attempting to do in the pages of Les Misérables. Now also, we have statements such as this from Louis XIV. I'm not too good with my Roman numerals. I do not believe I have the right to kill a man, but I feel it a duty to exterminate evil. I voted for the downfall of the tyrant, that is, for the abolition of prostitution for woman, of slavery for man, of darkness for the child. In voting for the Republic, I voted for that. I voted for fraternity, for harmony, for dawn. So we have this idea of these political figures also struggling with their not only their own identity, but how they are going to handle corruption and evil and sort of these other overarching issues like, mistreatment of children, mistreatment or poverty for women, sort of the sex trade, perhaps, whether or not you agree with it. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but all these sort of overarching things like poverty, women's rights, political persecution, crime and punishment, poverty, wealth, all these sort of political, social things that come up. And also the French Revolution, Marie Antoinette, the Huguenots, atheism versus faith. And obviously with the French Revolution, although Les Misérables takes place way after that, we can see that Paris, France, and all of these characters and all these political leaders are still suffering the effects, or they are promoting or benefiting from the effects of the French Revolution, if you will. And there's almost like this emotional, sociological, spiritual baggage that all of these people have to either deal with positively or negatively as a result of the French Revolution. But obviously we have Napoleon. He's another figure that comes up. Faith versus poverty, wealth corrupts. Absolutely, like Robert Greene, Hugo is in awe of the law of infection. Now that's a little reference to Robert Greene that I mentioned there, because Robert Greene, also a huge scholar of the classic novels like Tolstoy and Victor Hugo, and similar to Robert Greene, Victor Hugo sort of has this, sort of socio-political preachy undertone to Les Misérables and also Hunchback of Notre Dame. And it's, although he gives his evil, bad characters a lot of leg room to sort of commit evil acts and to do bad things, we are never unaware of Hugo's standpoint socially, politically, and spiritually regarding not only the social, moral context of Paris, France, but also him interjecting sort of his ideas of war and of politics and of poverty and of the battle of the sexes. And there's these beautiful transformative scenes where, Cosette and Jean Valjean are reflecting on their life's successes, their life failures. And Jean Valjean is one of the most, beautiful and sympathetic and empathetic characters in French literature, but also we get this idea of persevering and sort of this idea, sort of like we talked about with a lot of different novels, like we would see in the 13th Warrior perhaps, or some of the classics like Beowulf or the Odyssey, sort of this rapture, this metamorphosis, this ascension to this spiritual promised land through the course of suffering throughout our lives. So that's another important factor to also take into context. These characters are not suffering just for suffering's sake. They are suffering to sort of eventually reach this sort of social, moral, and spiritual and personal promised land, the sort of oasis of sort of heaven on earth, if you will, but also recognizing the fact that humanity suffers, and that there is good and evil in the world, and there's no getting away from that. Not to give away too many spoilers, but there is a sort of, very significant event that occurs early in the novel where Hugo is, sort of goes on this monologue of sort of critiquing the judicial system during this time of Paris, France. But Jean Valjean is witnessing a trial where another man is assumed to be him, and they are going to potentially give this man the death penalty. And Jean Valjean is forced to sort of face this reality, this not only the idea of false identity, but he also has to confront his past and his trauma that he has gone through. And he visits the trial of a man who stole apples, and whom the author thinks or claims, or who the court seems to believe and claim is Jean Valjean. And I believe that he sort of turns himself in, and he eventually escapes, but he is forced to reconcile the fact that not only does he has a criminal background and he's sort of a social pariah, but also the other how his life and his decisions have not only affected him, but have affected the society that he exists in. And on page 278, Jean Valjean, in fact, reveals his identity in court, and that is not quite the halfway point of the novel, but it definitely pushes us into this, into sort of the metamorphosis of Jean Valjean. And then a couple chapters later, he ends up being arrested, and then he escapes, like we discussed briefly before. And then the Battle of Waterloo, obviously with Napoleon, sort of occurs on book 1 of book 2, and that whole, I'm going to show you a picture of it right here. This title of this book is called Cosette, or this section of the novel is called Cosette, because his adoption of Cosette, his interactions with Cosette, is another motivating factor for him to escape his incarceration. Not only because he's being accused of something he did not do, but he is trying to find a way not only to flee this persecution politically and sort of socially, but he is looking for something to give his life a purpose and meaning, and he finds that beautifully in his relationship with Cosette. Now, we have talked about some of the political backgrounds, the sort of the political events, the wars, and one of my notes here says, interestingly enough, though anti-war, like Tolstoy, Hugo glorifies the action, or sort of this idea of war being sort of a stage of war as a grand and divine beast that can't be tamed, and sort of like we would sort of experience in War and Peace, for example, sort of like this epic, grandiose descriptions, these sort of moralistic interpretations, and these action-packed scenes of war, and sort of not only the physical mechanics of war, but also sort of the intellectual motivations of how Tolstoy, or Victor Hugo rather, claims that wars are begun, or how wars operate. We sort of get, although they're both, I would assume, anti-war novelists, they do sort of present war in this epic, sort of grandiose, inspiring fashion, which to me sort of borderlines begs the question: are they really anti-war, or are they sort of glorifying war? But I believe, especially during this time, during the Romantic era where Victor Hugo wrote, that was sort of part of his aesthetic, right? That was part of his rhetoric, was to sort of present the battle of war as sort of a, though tragic and though violent, sort of serving this sort of, how do I say, this not only does it serve a purpose, regardless of how bad it is for society and how much it harms people, but it sort of serves this divine purpose, for better or worse, for humans to sort of get from point A to point B on sort of a spiritual, social, and morally religious level. And then, the halfway point of the novel continues with Cosette and, Jean Valjean being in disguise, and they end up staying at this abbey for quite some time. They get some spiritual, emotional nourishment, but they're always on the run. And obviously Javert, the police official, is always 2 steps behind Jean Valjean, and he sort of eventually catches on to what takes place. And Jean Valjean is always on the run. So although he's on his path to redemption, he is, he adopted Cosette, and he sort of got this pseudo, father-daughter relationship with her. He is unable to really live 100% freely, emotionally and mentally, or even socially, because he's having to live in secret. And not only is he hiding his identity, but he's sort of running away from his past. And, obviously he can't do that forever, and that causes another conflict, sort of during his metamorphosis, this conflict of the self obviously occurs. And then Cosette and Jean Valjean escape to Paris, where sort of the halfway, not quite halfway point of the novel begins. But his love and his relationship with Cosette, this father's sort of pseudo father-daughter bond that they share, develops, but like we discussed earlier, is eventually interrupted when Cosette falls in love with Marius. Now, on page 659, one of my annotations says, "A lot of this book is complete nonsense, Hugo totally lost the plot." And that was just me sort of venting my frustrations with, sort of in a tongue-in-cheek manner, because of all the sort of intellectual, political, sociological rambling that we have to sort of sit through and suffer through Victor Hugo. But as we discussed earlier, that serves the purpose of further explaining the motivations of the characters. And obviously we could sort of, Victor Hugo could have omitted all of those sort of political, social, spiritual, religious essays, but it wouldn't be the same, the novel wouldn't have the same impact if these characters were sort of just naked without any sort of background, omnipresent narration to sort of discuss these overarching themes. And we don't really see a lot of writers really doing that today. We could maybe point to somebody like Tolkien, which maybe had a little bit of rhetoric that aided in sort of giving the novel a little bit more of a moral, sort of intellectual, spiritual background to what the characters were doing or what they were not doing. But Victor Hugo is obviously famous for his long rambles and but you have to sort of approach it as not a task to be suffered through, but that the fact that Victor Hugo is sort of helping you and he's aiding you as the reader to form your own opinions and to sort of help educate you into the journeys that these characters will sort of partake in. Now on page 894, we're getting towards the last couple hundred pages of Les Misérables. The conflict between Jean Valjean and his adopted daughter Cosette sort of obviously reaches a boiling point, and my annotation here says Cosette becomes a woman. There's a beautiful passage here, and sort of this is Jean Valjean sort of reflecting on not only the emotional and relationship transformation that's taken place between him and her, but he's also sort of reflecting on the physical transformation that his adopted daughter has undergone. It says, "This beauty blooming more and more triumphant and superb behind him, under his very eyes, on the naive and intimidating brow of this child. He looked at it from the depths of his ugliness, his old age, his misery, his reprobation, and his dejection. With dismay, he says to himself, 'How beautiful she is! What will become of me?'" So he's having to confront his whole entire life's loneliness and the fact that if he loses Cosette, he's basically going to be out on his own once again. One of my annotations here says Jean Valjean faces himself, and this occurs in beautiful passages such as the following. When he saw that it was positively ended, that she was escaping him, that she was slipping through his hands, eluding him, that it was a cloud, water, what he had before his eyes, this crushing evidence. Another is the object of her heart, another is the desire of her life. There is a beloved, that being Marius. I am the only father, I no longer exist. When he could no longer doubt, as he said to himself, she's going off away from me. So that is sort of the tragic aspect of Jean Valjean, is that he loses his sort of, not his attachment to Cosette, but he loses his perceived importance in Cosette's life. And towards the end of the novel, as Marius asks Jean Valjean's permission to marry his adopted daughter, is that Jean Valjean agrees, but he is, having to obviously deal with this internal struggle of losing sort of his perceived emotional attachment and vice versa, that he sort of had imagined that Cosette was going to be around forever. And it sort of not only alludes to the struggle of fathers and daughters, or perhaps a mother and a son, but it's, sort of this parental idea of creating something that you will eventually have to let go and lose. Yeah, so it's very tragic in that sense, because not only is he facing his own vagabondry, he's facing his own criminal background, his own traumas, his own struggles, but he's having to sort of relinquish the bond that his bond of salvation that he had achieved with Cosette. Cosette was the most beautiful aspect of his life, but now it's time for her to sort of leave the nest and make a life of her own. And sort of, we did briefly discuss his Victor Hugo's obsession with the sewers, and that's not only the first sort of detailed rant that Victor Hugo gives us, but just to kind of put it in a nutshell of why he's discussing the sewers, we'll kind of read the following. At the same time, it is a lesson. As we have just said, history passes through the sewer. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacres filter drop by drop through the pavements. The great public assassinations, the political and religious butcheries, traverse this vault of civilization and push their dead into it. To the reflecting eye, all the historic murderers are there, in the hideous gloom on their knees with a little of their shroud for an apron, dolefully sponging up their work. So we can sort of see that this beast of humanity, sort of structured in this sort of heaven-hell sort of esque fashion that Hugo introduces to us, is that the repercussions and the events and the history of man on earth sort of has this underworld, and that is the sewer of Paris, where all of man's follies and all of man's degeneracies and passions and love sort of regenerate and sort of recycle into the sewer. And it's sort of this testament to not only humanity's persistence, but also humanity's sort of overarching girth and overarching destruction, because there's too many people and there's too many wars and there's too many political struggles, and that the sewer sort of reflects the sort of the degeneracies as well as the accomplishments of society. And then sort of these political battles, the July Rebellion take place at some point in the novel, and then there's another significant historical event being July Monarchy with King Louis Philippe, and that is another sort of central part of sort of the political struggles that take place in Les Misérables. And like I said, you would have to take a lot of time to really master and sort of become more familiar with all the different battles and all the different historical figures and the different things that come up in Les Misérables. But you just have to sort of stay focused on the characters, stay focused on the motivations, the central themes, and don't get too lost or bogged down by not knowing sort of the battles or the events and sort of the political, sociological events that are taking place, although they are important. And at the end of the novel, Marius at last finally weds Cosette. Then we have this beautiful chapter called The Inseparable, which discusses the fate of Jean Valjean. And interestingly enough, when Jean Valjean sort of rescues the villain, which is Javert, whether or not you view him as a villain, he's the police official that's been pursuing Jean Valjean throughout the course of the entire novel. Even though Jean Valjean rescues Javert and sort of shows him that he doesn't have to keep pursuing him, and that he can sort of go off and live his own life freely. Javert is so, mentally and emotionally and morally and socially conflicted because he's lived his whole life in pursuit of Jean Valjean. He's built his entire career on it, that Javert ends up unliving himself because he is so at conflict, and almost without the pursuit, without the punishment of Jean Valjean, without getting that revenge that he sort of sought, he is sort of beside himself, and his life no longer has purpose. So it's interesting that certain characters in pursuit of good are sort of rewarded, like Jean Valjean and Marius, for example, and Cosette, but the characters that are sort of in pursuit of revenge and evil are the ones that end up not doing so well in the end. Beautiful passages in the end that we've marked here, but I do want you all to read it. I want to inspire, encourage you all to read it. I don't want to give away the entire plot. I'm not going to tell you exactly what happens to Cosette and Marius and Jean Valjean, but I did want to discuss briefly what happened to Javert, the persecutor of Jean Valjean. One of my annotations here says Jean Valjean reveals his identity to Marius. That's another really, really profound event. I don't want to tell you exactly what happens. And then finally, the characters sort of reach this new start, this redemption, and some of them, fade off into the sunset, and others you'll have to just wait and read it for yourself. But that is my condensed but rambly, as always, analysis of Les Misérables here on In-Depth Literature. Let me know if I missed any important themes of the novel, if I missed any important characters that you'd like me to further discuss, any important relationships that you thought influenced the novel, or some of the social events that obviously influenced the novel. And similar to something like Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas, there is a lot of espionage. There's a lot of people are taking on disguises. There's secret notes being given back and forth. There's people being jailed. There's people being accused of being the wrong person. There's political espionage and spiritual espionage and sort of social backstabbing and backdoor dealings. And all of that occurs in the epic, grandiose pages of Victor Hugo's Les Misérables. And I'm hesitant to sort of say that in conclusion, Les Misérables is about this, that, and the fourth or the third, because Les Misérables is an all-encompassing book and an all-encompassing study of the human experience socially, morally, and spiritually and religiously. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments below what you've been reading, what's your favorite Hugo novel. Make sure you guys follow me on Instagram at Andrew Marlowe Artist Official. Check out the playlist that we've curated for you ladies and gentlemen over here as well. Please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps me to continue to make videos. And we will talk to you all in the next one. And happy reading.